I'm going to spill the beans. Yeah, unfortunately, they're just coffee beans, so it's not that exciting. But I'm going to start way back in the middle of the 1400s. You see here a map of Istanbul that was Constantinople. And in 1453, the Ottomans took Constantinople. And during the 16th and 17th centuries, they expanded their empire, controlling the key trade routes to Asia, making goods like spices, silk, and porcelain more expensive for the Europeans because they put high taxes on them, they put tariffs on them. Nothing changes in history, by the way. And they made it really difficult for the Europeans to get what they wanted. And of course, the biggest commodity at the time there, not coffee, I'm going to talk about coffee in a minute, was spices. So if you can remember what your kitchen cupboards look like and what's in them, you probably, like me, have a cupboard with some spices in. Mine are in a sort of box. And every so often, I go in there and I look at the out of date, I smell them, and then I decide whether to put them back in. I might use them or throw them away. Well, at this time, they were the biggest prize there was out there. If you could trade in spices, you could make your fortune. And so what to do? Well, the Europeans, not collectively, of course, but different countries in Europe started at different times. They decided, well, we're going to have to find another route to the east. And this was, obviously, they can't get over land very easily, and stuff wasn't coming across the land, the Silk Road, as it was still operating, but the Ottomans were blocking it, basically. So they decided to find a sea route to the east. And one of the first to crack getting there was this chap, Alfonso de Albuquerque. He was sailing for Portugal, and in 1511 he got as far as Malaya, and he conquered Malacca, which was at the time a major trading hub that connected India, China, and the Spice Islands, or the Moluccas, which are part of Indonesia today. So while he was there, as you do, he explored the Indonesian archipelago, and particularly, this is what he was looking for. This group of islands here, which have been dubbed the Spice Islands, where the most valuable spices in the world were grown at that time. Can you believe it? It was cloves and nutmeg. My memory of nutmeg is my grandma having this sort of little tin with this dried up nut in it that she got out with a little grater and put on rice puddings when I was little. But that was so valuable at the time. And then in the late 1500s, the Dutch arrived and began challenging the Portuguese for control of the spice trade. And this is what, I'm sure you know parts of this history, it's always one challenging the other. And by 1605, the Dutch had ended the Portuguese dominance in Indonesia. And Batavia, this is a picture of it, a drawing, a painting of it, I should say, which was done about 1665, showing Batavia. It's actually Jakarta now. And so this became a Dutch stronghold in Southeast Asia. And then during the 17th and 18th century, they conquered a lot of Indonesia. They worked their way through the archipelago, taking local kingdoms through either military force, some alliances, some economic manipulation. Actually, the Dutch never got complete control of the Indonesian archipelago, but they did get enough to make a difference to the people who were living there. And once established, they began to introduce various crops. And one of these, of course, has to be coffee, because that's what I'm going to talk about. And this was in the late 16 and early 1700s. It seems the Indonesian climate was well suited for coffee plantations. Of course, as we know, it's near the equator. It also has many mountainous regions, which create this sort of really good microcosm for coffee. And the Dutch saw an opportunity to break the Arab monopoly on coffee production, because coffee originally came from Ethiopia. It was first cultivated on a large scale in Yemen, and then the Ottoman Empire, I've all mentioned again, took that over, and they controlled most of the coffee trade. Problem. And at this time, coffee was becoming, which one's you? I think me with coffee. Really, I think that could be me with coffee. You know, when you get into breakfast and they say orange juice, water, and you say, no, just coffee, please, now. But coffee at this time was becoming popular in Europe. It was not yet as central to our life as it is now. And it was a new product. It was something new. Europe were experiencing it for the first time. And of course, with any new product that people want, then people know there's money to be made out of it. But let's just reel back a bit and look at where it all started before the Dutch started to plant it in Indonesia, and we wanted it in the West. So, the origins of coffee, as I've said, was in the Arab world. And there is a legend, and I love these sort of legends, but I have to say it might not be true, but I could add to that it's probably not true. But it's a nice story. And so the story goes, or the legend goes, there was an Ethiopian goat herd called Kaldi. And one day he was out with his goats and he noticed they were eating some red berries. And after they'd eaten them, they became very energetic. And he said he saw them dancing. And so what to do? Your goats are dancing, you're standing there, a bit bored probably. So he ate some himself. And he started dancing too. Doesn't do that to me, does it to you? Was this the first caffeine high? So he was so excited about what he'd just witnessed, he picked some of the beans and took them to a nearby monastery. And he told the abbot what had happened. And the abbot listened to his story, and he thinks that these beans, if this really happened, these beans must be of a diabolical substance. So he threw them on the fire. What happens when you roast coffee? It smells amazing, doesn't it? And the aroma of the beans roasting changed his mind. He decided they must be of divine origin. So, being a clever chap, he began to make infusions of the bean, and he gave the drink to his monks to keep them awake during night prayers. Clever chap, eh? And news of this moved east and quickly spread through the Ottoman Empire, and there was a low-key trade which continued for some time. And then in 1544, the Imam of Yemen decided coffee should be cultivated there. He decided there's something in this. And coffee then began to be exported by around the 1500s through the from Yemen, and through the major port. They exported it through the port of Mocha. Keep that in mind for later. So it came out of Yemen through the port of Mocha. This gave the Yemen monopoly on coffee distribution in the Islamic world. And to maintain this monopoly, coffee merchants ensured that no live seeds or seedlings were exported. So you couldn't take either out of the country. It was banned. At this time, the coffee in Yemen was prepared by just boiling the beans, but as it spread through the Arab world, they found a better way of preparing it. They roasted the beans, then ground them finely and boiled them in water, which would, I think you agree, would make a much better drink. It was drunk both at home and in the emerging coffee houses, which were really popular places to go for all social activities. You could listen to music, maybe there'd be a performance of some sort. You could play board games, you could engage in conversation and keep up with the news of the day. And actually soon became very important centres for the exchange of news. And they were called the Schools of the Wise. When they finally opened in England, they became dubbed the penny universities, which was quite interesting. They opened all over Europe eventually. At the end of the 1500s, European merchants and travellers had actually begun to venture into the Ottoman Empire. And of course, they sampled coffee. And soon reports of what they called the wine of Araby were to reach the West. But not everyone was happy with this newfangled drink. Some people had already called for it to be banned. In 1511, a Turkish sultan called for it to be banned because of its stimulating effects. A few years later in Egypt, a similar ban was imposed, but coffee was popular, and these bans were overturned, and coffee became an accepted stimulant. Because, unlike alcohol, the drinker was left capable, it was said, at the time, of distinguishing a man from a woman and the earth from heaven, which again is always a good state to be in. And then around 1615, Europeans got their first taste of coffee. Venetian merchants who tried the drink in Istanbul, or Constantinople as it was, brought it back with them to Venice. And Venice really was the hub, the trading hub in Europe at that time. And then in Venice it began to be sold on the streets by vendors. But then in 1645 the first coffee houses opened in Italy. And then, as I've said, they became popular and sprung up all over Europe. Although, again, it quickly became a controversy issue. And some people reacted to this newfangled drink with superstition and fear, and they called it the bitter invention of Satan. In fact, this guy, Pope Clement VIII, was even asked to rule on this coffee controversy that was brewing, pardon the pun, about whether it was acceptable for Catholics to drink it. It is said that he tried it and said, "The devil's drink is so delicious, we should cheat the devil by baptizing it." However, I have to tell you, there are actually many versions of what he might have said. This is only one of them. However, he did settle in favour of Catholics being allowed to drink it. So we have to thank him. So, yes, to the Pope. And so this attractive red cherry that had caused controversy right from the start. So we had the Ethiopian abbot who thought it was from the devil, to a pope having to rule on it. There are actually over 100 different coffee species in the world, but only 2 in commercial coffee production, and they are the Arabica and the Robusta. And the Arabica is the smoother one, the more refined one, that takes more growing, and the Robusta is what it says. It's more robust and it's not as refined a drink. So this is a coffee tree. They have lush green leaves. They produce small white flowers, and then these bright red cherries. So exactly where do the Dutch and Indonesia come into the story? Well, in 1614, a Dutchman, this guy here, who was in the service of the Dutch East India Company, visited Mocha, remember the port, and drank something he described as hot and black. And he was impressed with it. But as I've told you, it was forbidden to take seeds and seedlings out of Yemen. What do you do? This is nice. I quite like this. Oh, I'm not allowed to take it out. Well, of course, we know what he did. He stole some, and he smuggled them back to the Netherlands. And he had them put in the botanical gardens there. And about 40 years later, in 1658, the Dutch used these stolen plants to begin coffee cultivation in their overseas territories, which at that point was now Central and South America, and also the Dutch East Indies. So they stole the coffee beans to get this industry going. The first island they planted coffee on was Java, and the Dutch colonial government developed plantations all over Java. And by the end of the 1600s, and actually by 1711, the first major commercial exports were underway, because its volcanic soil was great for growing coffee. So Indonesia became the first place outside of Arabia and Ethiopia where coffee was widely cultivated. It seems it was slightly before they were doing it in the Americas. Java became one of the biggest coffee producers in the world, and they shipped the coffee to Europe through the port of Batavia, now Jakarta, I said, and became Europe's preferred source for coffee. Indonesia, as you know, has thousands of islands, and coffee plantations spread to other islands over the next century. Soon, Sumatra, one of the islands, had a booming industry. Then there was Sulawesi, Bali and Timor, plus some of the smaller islands. But you know how the colonials work. There were very poor working conditions on these Dutch-owned coffee farms, which caused actually a lot of suffering for the local people. It caused poverty and actually sometimes near starvation amongst the local population. But hey, Europe's getting a load of coffee, so do they care? Not particularly, I think, wrongly at the time. It was good business for the Dutch. These are actually some of the former Dutch East India Company's warehouses beside the mouth of the main river in Jakarta. They were used to store spices, because they still want spices while they're out there, so nutmeg and pepper, and of course coffee. And other things as well, plus tea that was coming from China, and cloth, so that would be silk, ready to be shipped to the various ports in Asia and mainly in Europe. And we have to remember, it wasn't the coffee that initially attracted the Dutch out there and the other European nations, it was the spices. And so business was very good. This is actually a replica of an East India man, as they were called, of the Dutch East India Company. They would be coming and going in the port, laden with coffee and spices. And actually, interestingly, the coffee beans were used as ballast in the hold. So they'd fill the hold with coffee beans and then put all what I would call the posh stuff on the top. And by the 18th century, coffee shipped from Batavia sold for 3 guilders per kilogram in Amsterdam. So what you say, that means nothing to me. But if we just think about it, the annual income in Holland in the 18th century for the ordinary person was 200 guilders a year. So less than 20 guilders a month. And if you wanted a kilo of coffee, it was going to cost you 3 of those. So this was a luxury item. And only for the wealthy. But by the end of the century, the price did drop and coffee drinking spread from the elite to the general population. And the East Indies were the most important coffee supplier in the world during this time. The coffee trade was very profitable. It was popular as well, but it was very profitable. For the Dutch East India Company and for the Dutch East Indies government that replaced the East India Company in 1800 when the Dutch East India Company, like the British one eventually did, folded. It became bankrupt and had loads of problems. But as I've said, less so for the Indonesian farmers who were forced to grow it by the colonial government from about 1830 to 1870, so 40 years, they had to grow it under what was called the cultivation system. This was a colonial-inspired system. It was headed up by this guy, and what it meant was that people had to grow coffee and other crops as well, and deliver these what were called export crops to government warehouses instead of paying taxes. So this definitely included coffee. They were also growing sugar by this point, and also tobacco when that was introduced into the country, which meant that instead of land taxes, and 20% of village land had to be used to grow government crops for export. Or if you couldn't do that as a farmer, you had to work in government-owned plantations for 60 days of the year. And as a result of this policy, much of Java became a Dutch plantation. And of course, it caused great hardship, I've already said, for the farmers because it diverted their labour from growing what they needed, in particular from rice production, which was a staple of the country. And later on, rubber plants were from South America, which, by the way, were also stolen in the same way as the coffee plants, that's another story, were also introduced by the Dutch. And so it was all going really well for the Dutch. By the 1800s, they'd established large coffee plantations right across Indonesia, but disaster struck in 1876 when the coffee rust disease swept through the country, wiping out most of the Arabica, the best coffee plants, resulting in Robusta coffee being introduced into East Java, a bit of a desperate measure, in 1900 as a substitute. But when you don't treat people well, they become very unhappy, and resistance was growing against colonial rule. And so there was this sort of swelling of resistance, people talking about how awful it was and wanting to do something. And that lasted for quite some time. Nothing really happened. But then World War II broke out, and the Japanese occupied Indonesia from March 1942 until after the end of the war in the September of 1945. which really, in effect, ended 350 years of Dutch rule almost overnight. Many Indonesians actually initially welcomed the Japanese because they thought that they might get their independence this way, and they were cheesed off with the Dutch as well. A nationalist movement had started, and it got more so during the Japanese occupation. At one point, the Japanese, who thought they were about to lose, started saying, well, back us and we'll give you your independence. But of course, as you know, Japan surrendered, and Indonesia actually declared independence on August the 17th, 1945, before the Dutch could attempt to reclaim control. Smart move, eh? We'll actually, quick, I can imagine them saying, can't you, quick, let's do it now before the Dutch come back again. The Japanese have surrendered, we will declare our independence. But the Dutch, of course, refused to recognize Indonesian independence and attempted to retake control, which actually led to a 4-year war. So that was between 1945, the end of the war, and 1949, between the Indonesian revolutionaries and Dutch colonial forces. This is not an unusual situation. When I start to talk about the history of Malaya, I'll be talking about something similar. But finally, on December the 27th, 1949, the Dutch officially recognized Indonesian independence. Now you can see the sign in there. So Sukarno was elected as the first president of Indonesia. He served from that time right up to 1967. He was forced out of office in that year due to political and military pressure. I'm not going to go into the details because Brian is no doubt going to tell you more about that. But this military pressure following the 1965 attempted coup. So he lasted 2 years after the attempted coup. And the next chap was Suharto. He was actually an Indonesian army officer, he was a politician, and he was the longest serving president of Indonesia. He was actually widely regarded as a military dictator by international observers. But Suharto led Indonesia through whatever it needed to do. We think it's dubbed as a dictatorship for 31 years until his own resignation in 1998. Again, Brian will tell you more details, I'm sure, about that. The following year after independence, so we're reeling back a bit now, the Dutch-owned plantations were nationalised to be managed as state-owned plantations, and they were revitalised with new variety of the coffee Arabica. And these varieties were also grown by smallholders. The government set up a development programme to get the coffee back on track and also to include the smallholders, the small farmers in this development. And so coffee continued to be grown and be successful. Last year, Indonesia produced around 654,000 metric tons of coffee, but about 155,000 tons were for domestic consumption. I'm sure when we get to these places in Indonesia, you will see quite a lot of coffee around. The Indonesians are big coffee drinkers, and Java coffee is also one of the favourite blends of the West too. One of the most popular coffees is Mocha Java. Remember I said hang on to the name of that port? And this Mocha Java coffee is said to be grown from the plants that were initially stolen from Yemen and grown in Java. And it's said that the plants from the Yemen had a chocolatey flavour. And this is because they went through the ports of Mocha. This is where we get the name for coffee. Well, they're calling it Mocha Java. It's roast dark coffee. It's supposed to have a chocolatey blend. But if you go to Starbucks or wherever, if you ask for a mocha, you get coffee with chocolate, a spoonful of chocolate powder in it as well. So this is really where the West, we are using our term mocha. On Bali, you will get this coffee. It's called kopi tubruk. It's their traditional preparation of coffee, and it's very finely ground powder. It's seeped in water, boiling water, of course, and then while it's in your cup, and then you leave it to settle. And once the powder has settled, then you drink the coffee while trying to avoid the sort of muddy grouts that are in the bottom. This is one here. It looks more appetizing here. And previously, a popular way to deal with coffee beans was to age them. And one way that they did this, do you remember I said they used them as, the Dutch used them as ballast, was to seal the coffee beans in the hold of the cargo ships. And so they would sweat during the voyage, and they would then arrive a darker brown colour. And the darker brown the coffee was when it arrived into Europe, the higher the price was paid for it. In fact, if a captain of the ship managed to deliver extra brown coffee, they would be paid a bonus for it. It's thought it tastes better, but of course it would have been, don't you think, flavoured by the sea? I'm sure it would have in some way. And today even, some estates age a portion of their coffee for up to 5 years. And as they age, the beans turn from green, what they start with, to light brown. It says their flavour gains strength, and aged coffees are said to have flavours like cedar and spices like cinnamon or cloves. I personally can't always taste those in wine, never mind in coffee. And they also say they have a thick, syrupy body. So when you're out in Indonesia, do try the coffee. These aged coffees, if you want to buy some to take home with you, are usually called the Old Government, the Old Brown, or Old Java. So have a look at them. But you can see on here the packaging, it says aged Sumatra coffee. And then, of course, we have the most expensive and unusual coffee called Kopi Luwak. Anybody tried it? No? I've only ever had an audience where one person put their hand up to say they'd tried it. So I'm going to ask you on my next talk if anybody's tried it while you're out in Indonesia. If you went to the port talk, you know what happens. If you didn't go to the port talk, then maybe look away. The beans are collected after the civet cat has eaten them. This is when we were in Indonesia last time. This was the guide, and he got a little civet cat on his shoulder. The civet cats eat the ripe coffee cherries, and their digestive process removes the outer layers of the fruit, and then the feces of the cat are collected and washed really well, I hope, to extract the semi-digested coffee beans. So this is a civet cat here. It's about to produce you some really nice coffee. You might have to wait 24 hours before you can drink it. I don't know how long the digestive process is of civet cats, but you've got to wait a while. And of course, when I was putting this talk together, my inner child came out, and I had to show you a picture of the... Isn't that nice? Just before dinner. Just what you want to see. And so this is what they collect. And coffee experts actually say the unique flavours of Kopi Luwak come partly from the extraction of naturally occurring potassium salts from the beans during the digestive process. I mean, we can thank them. Who wants to drink potassium salts? I mean, we can thank them, can't we? That they've done that for us. And it says, once they've been through the digestive process of the civet cat, the result is a smooth, mild cup with a sweet aftertaste. And it is also described, when you're drinking it, as, I love this, as earthy. It would be, wouldn't it? Yes. And it's quite expensive. Here's a cup of it. It looks okay here. I mean, if you didn't know, if you'd not seen that first slide, you could tackle that, couldn't you? It actually can cost you around $10 American for a cup of it in Jakarta. And so coffee has been important in Indonesia for a long time. First to the Dutch, who really kicked off the planting of coffee there, and now to the Indonesians. After the fall of Suharto in 1998, Indonesia became a democracy. And it has a successful and thriving economy. It's one of the world's top coffee producers and exporters. It contributes 5% of the world's coffee exports, and the industry employs around 1.5 million people. Coffee is part of daily life there. It's a source of income. It's a source of hospitality. But if you are visiting any Indonesians and they offer you a cup of coffee, you might want to ask what sort it is, if you're not that keen on drinking what the civet cat's eaten. And today, coffee is grown all over the archipelago. You can see the dots of where it is grown. So I'm sure you will find some nice coffee when we get there. But I have to say, before I finish, ladies and gentlemen, it must be time to have another cup of coffee, even if we have to wait till after our dinner. I'm sure there's time for one more cup of coffee before the day closes, because, as we all know, behind every successful person is a substantial amount of coffee. Thank you.